Since early 2015, there's been allegations against Jane Sanders that during her tenure as the president of Burlington College in Vermont, she committed bank fraud by supplying a bank with misleading information on a loan application. Now, the main accuser here is the Republican equivalent of David Brock, who typically looks for any and all ways that he can smear Democratic political contenders. So, first and foremost, let's understand the context, because I think that's important. So, it's very clear that Bernie Sanders will be running again in 2020, most likely. So this right here, this FBI investigation that Bernie and Jane are now under, it's giving both neoliberals, Democratic neoliberals, and Republicans the opportunity to preemptively smear him and handicap his campaign in 2020 before he even announces it. So how will this impact Bernie Sanders? Well, even though it's the case that these accusations don't have any merit, it is an effective way to attack Bernie Sanders, and this is only a story all of a sudden because Bernie Sanders and Jane Sanders decided to finally hire attorneys, and second of all, the accuser found a way to tie this investigation to Bernie Sanders. So now that Bernie Sanders' name is involved, this is suddenly a national story that is making headlines in Politico and CBS News. But when it comes to this story, there's a ton of red flags. Now, as I've stated here, the individual who is the main accuser in this case, who's the main cheerleader for this case, who basically petitioned the FBI and Justice Department to investigate Jane and Bernie, is, like I said, the political equivalent of David Brock, and his name is Brady Tonsig. He is the vice chairman of the Vermont Republican Party, and also he was the chair of Trump's presidential campaign in Vermont. So that says a lot, but also Politico explains that he's constantly on alert for cases where he can slip the knife into Democratic politicians, and additionally, the rise of Bernie Sanders clearly stuck in his craw, especially given what he considered to be the lack of scrutiny Sanders enjoyed. It's probably because he's not corrupt, but they also state it was no surprise that Tonsig scrutinized Jane Sanders' rise and fall at Burlington College. Now, they go on to state, on July 7, 2014, 7 Days, a Vermont alternative weekly newspaper published a deeply reported piece by Alicia Fries about Burlington College's plummeting fortunes. 2 weeks after Fries's piece appeared, Tonsig requested loan documents from the Vermont Educational and Health Buildings Finance Agency that had issued the $6.5 million bonds for the land. Now, they're talking about the land that Jane Sanders purchased for Burlington College while she was the president. So Tonsig got all of these documents, he dug through them, and he found 2 people that were listed on the application for the loan. And on this application, it stated that these people pledged more money than they were in fact willing to donate. So essentially, the reason why these inaccuracies are problematic is because if you want to get a loan, you have to prove that you're going to be able to pay this loan back. And the way that Jane Sanders was trying to prove that the college would be able to pay this loan back was by telling the bank that they were expecting a certain number of donations. Now, Tonsig is alleging that she lied about how much donations the college would actually be receiving. And there was also another woman who was listed as a donor who would be giving the college $1 million, but the application didn't state that there was a stipulation to that and that the lady would only be giving this money upon the event of her death. So basically, there were a couple of inaccuracies here, and Tonsig, though, is taking those inaccuracies and he's alleging that Jane Sanders purposefully cited misleading information on this application so that way she could mislead them to get this loan, and that, of course, would in fact be an act of bank fraud. But remember that this isn't a loan that would personally enrich Jane or Bernie. It was for the college while she was the president, so she had nothing to gain personally from this other than improving her own legacy, because, I mean, you can really debate whether or not she was an effective president while she was the president of Burlington College, but she wanted to secure her legacy, so that's what you can say was really at stake. I mean, this wasn't a loan for Jane Sanders. They weren't going to buy themselves a house or a car or a yacht with this money. It was a loan for the college, so it's dumb to commit bank fraud and, be liable for something that wouldn't benefit you personally. But nonetheless, that didn't stop Tonsig from waging this political witch hunt, because obviously he's a Trump supporter, and knowing that Trump is going to be seeking re-election in 2020 and Bernie may challenge him, He's doing everything he can to discredit Bernie ahead of the 2020 election. So Politico explains, Brady Tonsing wrapped these figures and facts into the January 2016 letter to the U.S. Attorney and FDIC requesting an investigation into what he termed apparent federal bank fraud. In March of 2016, Tonsing doubled down in another letter to federal officials. This time, he made an allegation that struck to the core of Bernie Sanders' clean government image. As a result of my initial complaint, Tonsing wrote, I was recently approached and informed that Senator Bernard Sanders' office improperly pressured People's United Bank to approve the loan application submitted by the senator's wife, Miss Sanders. The evidence for that charge seems to be thin at best. According to sources familiar with the matter, the alleged pressure may have simply been a casual suggestion, perhaps chatter by a Sanders staffer over lunch, instead of a written document or email, and though such a suggestion might still be improper, it would be difficult to prove a direct connection to the senator. So to me, I find this really interesting because Bernie Sanders has had a squeaky clean career for how many decades now? Since before I've been born. And all of a sudden, now that he's going to be running for president, well, he's using his power and influence, which is completely out of character for Bernie, to influence a bank to push this loan through so Jane Sanders can look better. I really think you're going to have to try harder than this. And look, there's been accusations that Bernie Sanders is corrupt before, which I've shut down because they're just complete bullshit accusations. But the problem is that this one may actually stick because since Bernie Sanders is now being accused of using his influence to push this loan through, well, now it seems as though we have a real story. And since they decided to hire attorneys, well, there's this implication that Jane and Bernie might be guilty, right? Well, actually, no. As Politico explains, hiring a lawyer is no admission of guilt, but it does speak to the potential seriousness of the federal investigation. It would be negligent for anyone involved in the matter to not retain counsel, Weaver tells Politico magazine. Charges of bank fraud, say legal experts, are not easy to prove. It requires that the act be performed knowingly, says William Lawler, a former federal prosecutor, now with the law firm Vinson and Elkins. Not every mistake is going to rise to the level of a crime. So in other words, there has to be intent. But regardless, this case could still potentially be a problem because of who is in charge of the Justice Department and who's currently the president, and what he has to gain by Bernie Sanders going down because of this potential FBI investigation. Politico continues, once the federal investigation concludes, the Justice Department will decide whether or not to bring charges, which some worry will give Donald Trump a chance to affect the course of action. That gives President Donald Trump a chance to affect the course of the investigation and potential for prosecution, as Trump's Department of Justice, led by Attorney General Jeff Sessions, a longtime senatorial colleague of Bernie Sanders, will make the call on whether to prosecute the wife of a senator who has been deeply critical of this president and once called him a pathological liar. For the past year and a half, Bernie and Jane Sanders have been able to brush aside questions about the matter. It has not gone away. With all sides lawyering up, the case is gaining momentum just as Jane Sanders is acquiring new power and prominence in the national progressive movement. It may all be nonsense, as the senator likes to say, but it can no longer be ignored. So I just have to pause right here for a moment and mention the irony, because it's overwhelming to me. So this guy, Brady Tonsing, he's a Trump supporter who's accusing Bernie Sanders of using his power and influence to not personally enrich himself, like Trump's doing, but to instead benefit a college. Whereas this Trump supporter, he has someone who he supported and was the chair of the Vermont campaign of Donald Trump, who literally, there's evidence that he's using his power as president to enrich himself and push through business deals for himself in Argentina and for his daughter in China, and that's not a problem for Tonsing. So look, this is what this is about. Since Donald Trump is currently under investigation, and we don't know whether or not that investigation will continue up until the 2019 and 2020 election cycle, well, they're trying to come up with a critique against Bernie Sanders, because you already know what the Democratic Party and Bernie Sanders will inevitably use against Trump. They'll say he's under investigation for potential obstruction of justice, he's being sued for fraud, so they want something to kind of counter that. And if they can say, well, Bernie Sanders is also under investigation, then that's an incredibly effective tactic to use against Bernie Sanders, because obviously he is Donald Trump's worst nightmare, because Bernie can beat Donald Trump. And there's a reason why Donald Trump is silent about Bernie Sanders and never attacks Bernie. It's because he's scared shitless of Bernie Sanders. So now you have a Trump drone in Brady Tonsing doing the dirty work of President Donald Trump and pretending to care about ethical violations and corruption when he supported Donald fucking Trump, who is the king of corruption in Washington right now, when he said he was going to drain the swamp. Now, to kind of further show you where this guy's coming from, Brady Tonsing, he is an individual that championed another witch hunt that was pretty prominent, Benghazi. He's someone who pushed Benghazi, which obviously was a political witch hunt. Now, as Walker Bragman of Truth Against the Machine explains about Tonsing, he's tried to take down Senator Sanders before, filing a complaint with Vermont's Attorney General Bill Sorrell in 2016, alleging campaign finance violations. Sanders had sent out an email to supporters encouraging them to split donations between his campaign and that of another Vermont progressive, which Tonsing claims was an in-kind contribution that should have been reported. Sorrell, who had himself been the target of 6 similar Tonsing complaints, disagreed and declined to pursue the matter. So it's a political witch hunt being waged by a political smear merchant akin to David Brock, and we know what his intentions are. He's trying to cripple Bernie Sanders ahead of the 2020 election. I've said it once, I'll say it again. This is a political witch hunt. But Bragman continues, bank fraud is not a strict liability offense, meaning it requires intent, specifically intent to defraud, though not necessarily intent to defraud a bank, as the Supreme Court recently unanimously held in the 2016 case of Shaw v. United States. In other words, it is not enough if Jane submitted a loan application to the bank with incorrect information, unless of course she knew at the time that the information was false. And that makes sense because whenever you sign a legal document, or if you've ever gotten a loan, when you sign your signature, you're basically saying, I hereby state that all the information is correct to the best of my knowledge. So obviously, they have to prove that intent was there. So most likely, nothing will come of this, and certainly the portion that ties Bernie Sanders to corruption, using his influence to push for this loan, nothing's going to come out of that. It's just bullshit. And Bernie Sanders took the time to speak out against this obvious political witch hunt by saying it is nonsense. But now that there is a process going on which was initiated by Trump's campaign manager, somebody who does this all the time, has gone after a number of Democrats and progressives in this state, it would be improper at this point for me to add any more to that. And again, notice how this investigation centers around Jane Sanders and not Bernie Sanders. Jane Sanders is not running to be the president of the United States in 2020. Bernie Sanders most likely will be. So even if it's the case that Jane Sanders comes out guilty and they press charges against her, that still means nothing about Bernie Sanders, because obviously you're not going to be able to prove that he used this power and influence to push for this loan, because that would be stupid. Why risk your job to benefit a college? I mean, that's something that doesn't specifically benefit you personally, so why would you risk your career to do that when you have a squeaky clean career? I mean, you could dig through Bernie Sanders' history and you'll find nothing on him. The Democratic Party tried to do this, and the Republicans tried to do this, hence why they could only smear him as a communist, because they didn't know what to do, because Bernie Sanders is one of the few people in Washington that's not corrupt. So this whole thing, to me, it's just hypocritical, because the individuals, Trump supporters and Democratic neoliberals, Hillary supporters, they supported people who were under investigation, but now that Bernie Sanders is under investigation, it's the biggest deal ever. Bring it on. That's what I got to say to Donald Trump and Brady Tonsing. Bring it on, because it doesn't matter. Bernie Sanders can go into the 2020 election cycle, if he's the Democratic Party's nominee, and still win, even if he's under FBI investigation, because he has one thing that Donald Trump will never have: policy substance. So bring it on. It's very clear that the Republican equivalent of David Brock is desperate, and he's going to look for any and everything he can to demonize Bernie Sanders, but you're going to have to keep digging and do better than this.
Support this podcast by joining the independent progressive media revolution today at humanistreport.com.